Outside the White House, Ronald Reagan stood as the ultimate symbol of American strength, the leader who stood firm against the Soviet Union. But behind closed doors, a silent crisis was unfolding. Internal reports reveal that the president frequently lapsed into states of disorientation and cognitive freeze. When the man holding the nuclear codes begins to lose his grip on reality, the question is no longer about politics, but survival. This is the truth behind the darkest secret of the 1980s. A president governing the world while his own memory was fading away. Ronald Reagan was a man of profound contradictions, and these contradictions are the key to understanding how this cover-up was sustained. Born in 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, he rose from a childhood of poverty and an alcoholic father to become a sports broadcaster, a Hollywood B-movie actor, and eventually the governor of California. His greatest asset was never his intellectual depth or his policy expertise. It was his performance. He was a master of the camera. He understood lighting, timing, and the emotional resonance of a well-delivered line. He knew how to play the role of the president better than anyone who had ever held the office. This background in acting became his fatal weakness, his hamartia, and simultaneously his shield. As the Alzheimer's disease, which would not be officially diagnosed until 1994, but whose specters were visible much earlier, began to eat away at his neural pathways, Reagan's training kicked in. He could read a teleprompter with conviction, even if he didn't fully grasp the words. He could smile and wave at the press corps, projecting vitality while his mind struggled to orient itself in time and space. The public saw the performance. They saw the tanned skin, the thick hair, and the sharp suits. They did not see the blank stares that occurred the moment the cameras cut away. This duality created a dangerous illusion. The presidential body was healthy and vigorous, masking the presidential mind that was atrophy in real time. It was a deception that required a sprawling cast of supporting actors to maintain turning the West Wing into a theater set where the main objective was not just governance, but the preservation of the leading man's dignity. The central figure in this elaborate production was Nancy Reagan. To dismiss her merely as a devoted wife is to misunderstand the power dynamics of the 1980s. Nancy was the gatekeeper. She was fierce, brittle, and terrifyingly protective. She realized, perhaps before anyone else, that her husband was fading. In the wake of the 1981 assassination attempt, which had nearly killed him and left him physically weakened and psychologically vulnerable, Nancy's protective instinct metastasized into obsession. She did not trust the Secret Service. She did not trust the cabinet, and she ultimately did not trust the randomness of the universe. This fear drove her into the arms of the irrational. She brought Joan Quigley, a San Francisco astrologer, into the inner sanctum of American power. It is a fact of history that sounds like the plot of a satire, yet it is documented truth. Major Cold War decisions were timed according to the alignment of the planets. The signing of treaties, the president's travel schedules, and even his cancer surgery were dictated by Quigley's charts. Nancy used these astrological forecasts to control access to the president. If the stars said it was a bad day, the president stayed in his quarters. If the stars were aligned, he was trotted out. This introduced a layer of chaos and superstition into the highest levels of government. It meant that the nuclear superpower was being steered not strictly by intelligence reports or diplomatic strategy, but by a shadow government composed of a worried wife and her psychic advisor, filling the vacuum left by the president's declining cognition. This shadow government challenged the fundamental assumptions of democratic accountability. The story of Reagan's second term reveals a system running on autopilot, maintained by unelected bureaucrats and family members who made a silent pact to hide the truth. They justified it as patriotism, claiming they were protecting the country from the instability that a resignation would cause. But in doing so, they usurped the Constitution. This cognitive erosion was not happening in a vacuum. It was unfolding during a decade of high anxiety. The Soviet Union was crumbling, but dangerous, a wounded bear with thousands of warheads. The AIDS epidemic was ravaging the homeland. The Iran-Contra scandal was brewing in the basement of the White House. The nation needed a leader who was sharp, engaged, and capable of navigating these treacherous waters. Instead, they got a man who was increasingly living in the past. Staffers reported that Reagan would spend hours recounting stories from his Hollywood days, blurring the lines between the movies he starred in and the wars he actually fought. He once tearfully described a scene of liberating a concentration camp to the Israeli prime minister, a scene he had never witnessed in person, but had likely seen in newsreels or films. The boundaries of his reality were dissolving. This specific form of cognitive decline creates a unique kind of horror. It is the horror of the empty suit. When you look at the footage of Reagan in his later years, you are often looking at a shell. The charm is there, the voice is there, but the processing power is flickering. The tragedy lies in his isolation. He was surrounded by people who adored him, yet he was fundamentally alone in his confusion. He became a passenger in his own presidency, steered by aides who treated him less like a boss and more like a precious, fragile artifact that needed to be carried gently across the finish line of his term without breaking. The cover-up was not a single event, it was a daily operation. It involved simplifying his briefing papers from complex dossiers into single-page memos with pictures. It involved scripting his answers for press conferences down to the specific reporter he should call on. It involved cutting short meetings when he began to drift. It was a conspiracy of silence that implicated everyone from the chief of staff to the White House physician, and it worked. The American public re-elected him in a landslide in 1984, oblivious to the fact that the man they were voting for was already exhibiting the early undeniable markers of the disease that would eventually claim his life. However, the cracks in this meticulously constructed facade were forming long before the second term. While the retrospective diagnosis provides a label, the symptoms were manifesting in real time. The world finally witnessed this rupture on Sunday evening, October 7th, 1984, in Louisville, Kentucky. It was the night the great Communicator stopped communicating. The setting was the Kentucky Center for the Performing Arts, a venue filled with the expectant hum of a nation tuning in to watch a gladiator match. This was the first presidential debate between the incumbent Ronald Reagan and his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Walter Mondale. On paper, it should have been a victory lap for Reagan. The economy was recovering, patriotism was surging, and his polling numbers were stratospheric. But inside the Reagan camp, the mood was not one of confidence. It was one of containment. They knew something the public did not. The president was tired, he was confused, and the great Communicator was struggling to find his words. The debate began under the harsh glare of television lights, a sensory environment designed to test mental agility. For a man of 73, arguably already suffering from the early onset of cognitive degradation, the stage was not a platform, it was a trap. As the moderator posed questions about economic policy and deficit reduction, the audience witnessed a transformation that was as subtle as it was terrifying. The confident stride was gone. In its place was a hesitant shuffle. When Reagan began to speak, the cadence that had defined his career, the warm, rhythmic baritone that comforted millions, stumbled. He grasped for statistics that seemed to dissolve the moment he reached for them. He mixed up his notes. He looked down at the podium, not with authority, but with the panic of a student who realizes he is taking the wrong exam. Then came the moment that stopped the hearts of his inner circle. In response to a question about Social Security and Medicare, Reagan attempted to launch into an anecdote, a storytelling device that had always been his safety net. He began to speak about driving his car down the Pacific Coast Highway in California. It was meant to be a metaphor, a relatable image to illustrate a policy point. But halfway through the sentence, the neural bridge collapsed. He lost the thread. He wasn't talking about policy anymore. He was just an old man talking about a car ride. The sentence meandered, twisted into a verbal cul-de-sac, and then simply stopped. For several agonizing seconds, there was silence. It was a mental freeze, a blackout broadcast live to 80 million people. On the split screen, Walter Mondale looked on, his expression a mix of pity and discomfort. He later recalled that he could physically sense Reagan's confusion, describing it as looking at a man whose batteries were running low. Mondale faced a brutal political dilemma in real time. If he attacked the president now, he would look like a bully beating up a grandfather. If he did nothing, he was complicit in the charade. He chose to wait, letting the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Backstage in the holding room, the reaction was immediate and visceral. John Rogers, a key campaign aide, watched the monitor with his hands over his face. He later admitted that he wanted to vomit. This wasn't a gaffe. A gaffe is saying the wrong word. This was a malfunction. It was the biological reality of the president's brain failing to process the syntax of his own thoughts. The panic among the staff was not just about losing the election. It was about the sudden, undeniable realization that their candidate might not be mentally fit to finish the 90-minute debate, let alone a 4-year term. The possibility of the president collapsing on stage, either physically or mentally, became a tangible, suffocating fear in that small room. Neurologists now point to this debate as a textbook display of the early stages of dementia. When the brain is under stress and standing before a global audience is the ultimate stress test, the cognitive reserves are depleted rapidly. The brain struggles to access episodic memory, specific events, and semantic memory, facts and concepts. When Reagan froze, he was likely experiencing a phenomenon known as confabulation or derailment, where the mind, unable to find the correct path, jumps to an unrelated association, in this case, the drive down the coast, before shutting down entirely to protect itself from further error. The aftermath of the Louisville debate was a masterclass in political damage control, designed to bury the medical reality under a layer of spin. The narrative pushed by the White House the next morning was that the president had been over-prepared. They blamed the brutal regimen of mock debates, claiming his head was stuffed with too many facts by overzealous staffers. It was a brilliant excuse because it turned a cognitive deficit into a work ethic virtue. The president worked too hard. But the truth was far darker. The facts were not the problem, the processor was. Nancy Reagan was furious. She lashed out at the staff, blaming them for exhausting her husband. This reaction is psychologically revealing. It suggests that Nancy knew the limits of her husband's endurance better than anyone. She knew he was a finite resource that was being depleted. Her anger was the anger of a guardian who sees the gates being breached. She immediately moved to tighten the circle even further, restricting his schedule and demanding that future debate preps be simplified. The goal shifted from winning the argument to surviving the appearance. This incident fundamentally changed the dynamic of the 1984 election. For the first time, The age issue was no longer a taboo subject whispered by partisan hacks. It was the headline on the cover of Time magazine. The question, "Is he too old?" was code for, "Is he senile?" The Wall Street Journal, a bastion of conservative support, ran a headline asking if Reagan was fit to serve. The psychological impact on the American public was profound. They had seen the glitch. They had felt the unease. The invincible cowboy had been revealed as a mortal, fragile old man. However, the human capacity for denial is powerful, especially when the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. The public wanted Reagan to be okay. They needed the father figure to remain strong. And so, when the second debate rolled around in Kansas City a few weeks later, the stage was set for a redemption arc that felt scripted by Hollywood. Reagan delivered the famous line, "I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." The crowd erupted in laughter. Mondale laughed, the tension broke. But that joke was not an improvisation of a sharp mind. It was a pre-written, rehearsed line stored in his stock phrase library, ready to be deployed the moment the keyword age was mentioned. It was a calculated misdirection designed to shift the audience's attention away from the cognitive decline and back to the charismatic persona. It worked. The laughter drowned out the ticking clock. The glitch of Louisville was dismissed as a bad night, a fluke. But medically speaking, diseases like Alzheimer's do not have flukes. They have progressions. The freeze in Louisville was not an error, it was a forecast. By dismissing the events of October 7th, 1984, the American political system made a silent agreement to ignore the biological reality of its leader. They accepted the joke and ignored the silence. This decision cleared the path for Reagan's second term, but it also ensured that the decline witnessed on that stage would continue unaddressed and unchecked behind the closed doors of the Oval Office. The glitch was not the end of the story. It was merely the opening scene of a much longer, darker tragedy, where the stakes would rise from embarrassing pauses to the potential for nuclear miscalculation. The voters went to the polls in November and re-elected a man who, on his worst days, could not remember driving down the Pacific Coast Highway, yet was entrusted with the roadmap to the 21st century. The cover-up had successfully survived its first public test. The silence that descended upon Louisville in 1984 did not begin on that stage. It began 3 years earlier, born from a singular moment of violence that physically restructured the presidency. If the debate was the symptom, the gunshot wound was the catalyst. On March 30th, 1981, at 2:27 p.m. outside the Washington Hilton, John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots in 1.7 seconds. The narrative, we are told, is one of heroic resilience. The president walked into the hospital under his own power, cracked jokes with the surgeons, and returned to the Oval Office as if nothing had happened. This is the Hollywood version. The medical reality is a story of hypoxia, trauma, and a brain forever altered. The bullet that struck Reagan did not hit him directly. It ricocheted off the armored side of the presidential limousine, flattened into a coin-like disc, and sliced through his left armpit. It tore through his lung and stopped less than an inch from his heart. By the time the Secret Service vehicle screeched into the bay of George Washington University Hospital, the President of the United States was not merely wounded, he was dying. The sheer biological cost of this event was catastrophic. Reagan was 70 years old, the oldest man ever to assume the presidency at that time, and he lost nearly 50% of his blood volume. For a geriatric patient, this level of hemorrhagic shock is catastrophic. When blood pressure plummets, the brain is starved of oxygen. Even for a few minutes, this hypoxic insult can initiate a cascade of cellular damage that does not reveal itself immediately. Modern neurology offers a chilling hypothesis regarding this event. We now know that significant physical trauma and deep anesthesia in the elderly can act as a trigger for neurodegenerative diseases. It is known as post-operative cognitive dysfunction, POCD, but in patients with a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, it can be the spark that lights the fuse. The stress of the surgery, combined with the immense shock to the system, may have accelerated the accumulation of beta amyloid plaques in the president's brain. In essence, the Ronald Reagan who went under the anesthesia on March 30th was not the same man physiologically as the one who woke up. The glitch of 1984 was likely being written in the scar tissue of 1981. While the doctors repaired his body, the near-death experience rewired his psychology in a way that would define the rest of his tenure. When Reagan opened his eyes in the recovery room, he did not see his survival as a triumph of modern medicine. He saw it as an act of God. He told Cardinal Terence Cook, "I have decided that whatever time I have left is left for him." This was not just a pious sentiment. It was a fundamental shift in his operating system. This Messiah complex created a dangerous dichotomy. On one hand, it gave him a serene, almost supernatural confidence. He believed he had been spared for a specific divine purpose, to destroy Soviet communism. This conviction allowed him to take bold, unprecedented risks that terrified his advisors, but ultimately helped end the Cold War. He operated with the fearlessness of a man who believed he was immortal until his mission was complete. However, the shadow side of this spiritual awakening was a detachment from the mundane details of governance. If you believe you are on a divine mission, the nuances of budget deficits, environmental regulations, or the legality of funding Contras in Nicaragua seem trivial. Reagan began to focus almost exclusively on the big picture, leaving the machinery of government to subordinates. He became a big concept leader not because of management style, but because his brain was increasingly incapable of handling the granular details. The assassination attempt gave him a moral license to disengage from the complex realities that confused him. Crucially, the bullet did more than change Reagan. It broke Nancy. If Reagan emerged from the hospital with a sense of destiny, Nancy emerged with a sense of terror. She had watched her husband turn ashen gray and collapse. She realized that the Secret Service, the most elite protection force on Earth, had failed. The bullet had come out of nowhere, shattering the illusion of safety provided by the Secret Service. Logic and standard security protocols had failed to stop a madman with a cheap revolver. This trauma acted as the psychological key that unlocked the door to the irrational. When the visible world fails to make sense, the terrified turn to the invisible. Nancy's reliance on Joan Quigley was not a frivolous hobby. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic universe. She needed to know where the next bullet was coming from. She needed to control the invisible forces because the visible ones had proven useless. Thus, the assassination attempt created the perfect storm for the cover-up of the second term. It physically weakened a 70-year-old brain, making it susceptible to rapid decline. It psychologically detached the president from the day-to-day operations, creating a vacuum of power. And it traumatized the First Lady, transforming her into a paranoid gatekeeper willing to use any means, even the occult, to shield her husband. The stage was set. The president was now a vessel for a divine mission, steered by star charts, walking slowly into the fog of forgetfulness. In the high-stakes theater of the Cold War, where the balance of global survival rested on the edge of a razor, we are taught to believe that the American presidency is a fortress of rationality. We imagine the Oval Office as a sanctuary of data where decisions are weighed by serious men poring over intelligence dossiers, satellite imagery, and economic forecasts. We assume that the schedule of the commander-in-chief is a masterpiece of logistical efficiency, designed by the National Security Council to maximize American leverage. But the terrifying reality of Ronald Reagan's second term requires dismantling this assumption. The historical truth is as absurd as it is chilling. For nearly 4 years, the most powerful nation on earth was not governed by the principles of the Enlightenment or the strategies of the Pentagon. It was governed by the alignment of the stars, the phases of the moon, and the retrograde motion of Mercury. As the neural pathways in Ronald Reagan's brain began to silently erode, creating a vacuum of leadership at the heart of the executive branch, power did not disappear. Instead, it migrated. It slipped quietly out of the West Wing, away from the elected officials and the constitutional officers, and crossed the colonnade into the private residence of the East Wing. It settled firmly in the hands of Nancy Reagan, a woman who is too often dismissed by history as merely a devoted socialite. In reality, Nancy Reagan became the unacknowledged chief of staff, the ultimate gatekeeper who stood between a fading president and a world that demanded his attention. But Nancy herself was governing from a place of profound trauma, and her decisions were not guided by political science, but by a secret telephone line connected to a luxury apartment on Nob Hill in San Francisco. The path to a government ruled by the zodiac began with that same gunshot in 1981. The assassination attempt by John Hinckley Jr. did more than puncture the president's lung. It punctured the First Lady's reality. Nancy Reagan had always been a worrier, a woman who clung to her husband with a fierce, almost desperate possessiveness. But watching him turn the color of paper, watching the Secret Service fail, and watching the best doctors in the world struggle to save him, shattered her faith in the visible world. The rational systems had failed. Security protocols had failed. Logic had failed. In her mind, the bullet had emerged from the chaos of the universe, and she was seized by a terrifying realization. She could not protect him with guns or laws. She needed to see the invisible dangers before they materialized. She needed to control fate itself. It was in this vacuum of terror that Joan Quigley entered the narrative. Quigley was not the stereotype of a mystic. She was not a storefront fortune teller with a crystal ball. She was a Vassar graduate, a member of the San Francisco elite, a woman of intellect and pedigree who spoke with the authority of a scholar. She presented astrology not as a parlor game, but as a rigorous science, a mathematical way to map the dangerous currents of the cosmos. After the shooting, Nancy was introduced to Quigley by Merv Griffin, and Quigley made a seductive claim. She told the First Lady that the assassination attempt could have been predicted. She claimed that the alignment of the planets on that March afternoon had been clearly malevolent, and had she been consulted, she could have warned the president to stay indoors. For Nancy, who was drowning in helplessness, this was the lifeline she had been praying for. It offered the illusion of control. By the start of the second term, as Reagan's cognitive glitches became more frequent and the need to shield him became more urgent, this relationship evolved from a personal comfort into a shadow structure of governance. A clandestine infrastructure was built. A private phone line was installed in the White House residence, secure from the switchboard operators. Nancy arranged for Quigley to be paid through a third party to avoid any paper trail that might alert the press or the public. The astrologer became the single most influential advisor to the presidency, yet she never held a security clearance, never swore an oath of office, and never set foot in the Situation Room. Her influence was exerted entirely through the telephone receiver, whispered into the ear of a First Lady who was terrified of the future. The instrument of this control was the calendar. It became the most guarded and consequential document in Washington, D.C. Every few weeks, Quigley would cast the president's horoscope, analyzing the transits of the planets through his solar chart. She would then issue a forecast that categorized every single day into a rigid color-coded system. Green days were favorable. These were the only days when the president was permitted to travel, to make major policy announcements, or to engage in high-stakes diplomacy. Red days were dangerous. On a red day, the president was to remain effectively under house arrest. He was to avoid the Rose Garden, avoid the press corps, and avoid making any decision that could shape the future of the country. Amber days were neutral, but required extreme caution. This system effectively paralyzed the traditional operations of the White House. Ronald Reagan, the chief of staff during the second term, found himself living in a Kafkaesque nightmare. A former Marine officer and the titan of Wall Street who had run Merrill Lynch, Reagan was a man of hard data and chain of command. He arrived at the White House expecting to run the executive branch with military precision. Instead, he found himself in a power struggle with the stars. In his memoirs, he recounted the utter absurdity of his daily existence. He kept a copy of Quigley's color-coded calendar on his own desk, hidden under paperwork. Before he could schedule a meeting with the Senate Majority Leader, before he could plan the State of the Union address or even authorize the engines of Air Force One to start, he had to consult the colors. The friction this caused was catastrophic. There were times when crucial diplomatic windows opened, moments when the Soviets were ready to talk, or when domestic legislation needed a presidential push. But Ronald Reagan was forced to tell the cabinet that the president was unavailable. He could not tell them the truth, that Mars was in a hostile aspect to Saturn. He had to invent excuses, citing vague scheduling conflicts or minor illnesses. This eroded the credibility of the administration and fueled the rumors that the president was disengaged. But for Nancy, the calendar was not just about superstition. It was a tool of the medical cover-up. As Reagan's dementia progressed, his bad days became harder to predict. The red days gave Nancy a perfect, unimpeachable alibi to hide him from the world. If Ronnie woke up confused, unable to recognize his surroundings, she didn't need to explain his condition to the staff. She simply pointed to the calendar. The stars provided the cover story for the pathology. The level of specificity dictated by Quigley was staggering, reaching into the minutiae of Cold War geopolitics. The most chilling example occurred in 1987, during the negotiations for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF, treaty. This was one of the most significant disarmament treaties in history, a document that would eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons and pull the world back from the brink of annihilation. The date for the signing in Washington was set, but the time was not. The State Department assumed it would happen at a standard hour. Nancy Reagan intervened. After consulting Quigley, she decreed that the treaty could only be signed at exactly 1:30 p.m., not 1 p.m., not 1:45 p.m. It had to be 1:30 p.m. because that was the precise moment a specific planetary alignment favored Ronald Reagan's Aquarius nature. And so, the leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the President of the United States, along with the entire global press corps, were forced to wait until the cosmic window opened. The peace of the world was held in suspension until the astrologer gave the signal. This bizarre dependency reached its zenith during the controversies that plagued the second term, specifically the Iran-Contra scandal. As the administration began to crumble under the weight of investigations, the president needed to be front and center, projecting strength and clarity. But Nancy, interpreting Quigley's warnings of a malevolent flux in the charts, kept him hidden. She imposed a veritable lockdown on the president's image. Ronald Reagan, desperate to save the presidency, engaged in furious shouting matches with Nancy over the telephone. He argued that the president looked weak, that he looked like he was hiding. Nancy was immovable. Her loyalty was not to the polls or the party. It was to the survival of her husband. In one infamous exchange, Reagan hung up on the First Lady, a breach of protocol that sealed his fate. He was fired shortly after, a casualty of a war he couldn't win because he was fighting against the Zodiac. This created a profound paradox. The 1980s were the apex of American technological triumph. This was the decade of the space shuttle, the personal computer, and the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program that aimed to use lasers and satellites to shield the nation. The United States was projecting an image of scientific invincibility. Yet, at the very pinnacle of this pyramid of reason, the actual decision-making process had regressed to the medieval. It was a court ruled by omens. The nuclear football, containing the codes to incinerate civilization, was being carried behind a man whose movements were choreographed by an astrologer in San Francisco. It was a juxtaposition that, had it been known at the time, would have likely caused a constitutional crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution provides a clear mechanism for the removal of a president who is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. It is a safeguard designed to prevent a leader from holding the country hostage to their own incapacity. But the amendment assumes that the incapacity will be visible, that it will be medical and verifiable. It does not account for a situation where the incapacity is masked by a wall of superstition and managed by a spouse. Nancy Reagan effectively nullified the Constitution by creating a prosthetic presidency. She and Quigley became the external hard drive for Reagan's failing memory. They processed the data, assessed the risks, and made the scheduling decisions that his brain could no longer handle. They were not elected, they were not accountable, and they were operating in total secrecy. By the twilight of the administration, the isolation of Ronald Reagan was nearly absolute. The great communicator was surrounded by a silence that was deafening. He was a prisoner of the very protection that kept him in power. He moved through the White House like a ghost in his own life, hitting his marks on the green days and vanishing on the red days. The public saw the waves, the smiles, and the salutes, but they did not see the frantic choreography happening just out of frame. They did not see the astrologer's charts spread out on the First Lady's bedspread. They did not hear the desperate phone calls to San Francisco asking if it was safe for the president to leave his room. The cover-up was a success in the short term. Reagan left office with his popularity intact, the Teflon president, to the very end. But the cost was a fundamental betrayal of the Democratic compact. The people believed they were being led by a man of conviction. In reality, they were being led by a man of confusion, propped up by a woman of fear, both of them dancing to the tune of the stars. While the astrologer could control the schedule, she could not control the syntax. The decline that was hidden from the calendar was leaking out in the sentences, and the science of linguistics would eventually provide the smoking gun that no star chart could conceal. The president was speaking, but the vocabulary was vanishing, one word at a time. While the astrologers in San Francisco were busy mapping the movements of Jupiter and Mars to protect the president's schedule, a far more reliable map was being drawn in plain sight, hidden within the very thing Ronald Reagan was most famous for, his voice. For decades, the thousands of hours of audio recordings, press conferences, and speeches stored in the National Archives were viewed merely as historical records of policy and statecraft. Historians mined them for quotes about the Soviet Union or supply-side economics. But in recent years, a different kind of researcher has returned to these tapes with a darker purpose. They have treated the presidential archives not as a library, but as a biological crime scene. By applying the cold, unyielding tools of forensic linguistics and computer algorithms to the unscripted words of the president, they have uncovered a pattern of decay that is as undeniable as a fingerprint left on a weapon. The evidence of the president's cognitive collapse was never hidden in a locked safe or shredded by a loyal aide. It was broadcast live on national television for 8 years, hiding in the grammar of his sentences and the shrinking borders of his vocabulary. The magnitude of this decline lies in the specific cruelty of the disease. Alzheimer's does not strike like a lightning bolt. It invades like a slow-moving fog, silently occupying the territory of the mind long before the invasion is noticed by the outside world. We often associate the disease with memory loss, the forgetting of keys, names, or faces. But neurologically, one of the earliest casualties is language. The disease relentlessly attacks the temporal lobes, the region of the brain responsible for vocabulary, semantic processing, and the retrieval of nouns. The brain, a miraculous survival engine, attempts to compensate for this damage. When it cannot find a specific word like economy, missile, or treaty, it does not simply stop. It improvises. It substitutes a vague word like thing, situation, or well. It resorts to circumlocution, talking around the missing concept in a widening circle of simple words. The architecture of speech simplifies. The scaffolding remains standing, but the intricate, ornate details of the facade crumble into dust. In 2011, this biological reality moved from theory to proof. A landmark study conducted by researchers at Arizona State University, led by Vizar Berisha, provided the smoking gun that historians and conspiracy theorists had been debating for decades. They did not rely on anecdotes or memories. They used data. They fed the transcripts of every press conference from Reagan's 2 terms into an algorithm designed to measure linguistic complexity. But a study requires a control group. To prove that Reagan's decline was pathological and not just the natural result of aging, they needed to compare him to a man of similar age, background, and stress levels. They chose George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president and successor, a man who served in the same pressure cooker of the White House during the same era. The results of the comparison were startling, creating a graph that looked less like a linguistic analysis and more like a medical chart. George H.W. Bush's linguistic timeline was a flat line. From the beginning of his vice presidency to the end of his presidency, his vocabulary remained stable, his sentence complexity consistent, and his use of unique words unwavering. His brain, while aging, was maintaining its structural integrity. Reagan's line, however, plummeted. The data revealed a precipitous statistical drop in the number of unique words used by the president as his second term progressed. In his first term, Reagan spoke with the rhetorical flourish, the diverse vocabulary, and the sharp wit of a man who had made his living as a professional communicator. He used specific nouns and complex verbs. By the second term, his lexicon had shrunk. The algorithm detected a significant spike in the use of nonspecific nouns and fillers. When asked a complex question about the Contras in Nicaragua or the structural deficit, the president in the late 80s would frequently start sentences with well or rely on stock phrases, rehearse blocks of text he had memorized years prior. The computer found that he was repeating the same safe, simple phrases over and over again, like a needle stuck in a groove. This is a classic clinical marker of dementia known as anomia. The brain, unable to generate new linguistic pathways to describe a new complex reality, retreats to the familiar, well-worn tracks of old memories. The great communicator was not choosing to keep it simple. He was running out of words. The library of his mind was losing its books, shelf by shelf. This linguistic erosion provides the scientific explanation for the terrifying mental freezes that haunted his staff. These were not just pauses for dramatic effect, they were processing failures. When the president stopped mid-sentence, looking into the middle distance with that characteristic tilt of the head, it was because the neural bridge to the next word had physically collapsed. The synapses were firing, but the signal was not connecting. But the cover-up extended beyond the press office. It rotted the integrity of the medical professionals who were sworn to protect him. The role of the White House physician is one of the most ethically complex positions in government. They are doctors bound by the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, but they are also political appointees, bound by loyalty to the patient who is also their commander-in-chief. Dr. Daniel Rugge and later Dr. John Hutton, the physicians who tended to Reagan, publicly maintained that his mental status was pristine. They cited the results of his annual physicals, which always included a brief mental status exam. These reports were released to the press with glowing, almost hyperbolic summaries. The president is in excellent physical and mental health, a man of 75 with the body of a 50-year-old. But what was omitted from these reports is the phenomenon known as the conspiracy of optimism. In the elite medical community, it is well documented that doctors often unconsciously grade VIP patients on a curve. No doctor wants to be the one to diagnose the President of the United States with brain damage. It is a diagnosis that ends careers and starts constitutional crises. Furthermore, the standard tests used in the 1980s, like the mini mental state examination, were woefully inadequate for a man of Reagan's intelligence and background. These tests ask a patient to count backwards from 100 by sevens to name the current president or to identify the location. A man with a high IQ, even in the early stages of decline, possesses what neurologists call cognitive reserve. He can mask his symptoms during a short, structured interaction. He can turn on the charm, crack a joke, smile that famous smile, and pass the test, even as his ability to process abstract concepts is disintegrating. Reagan was an actor. He knew how to play the role of a healthy man. He could perform sanity for 10 minutes in a doctor's office, hiding the fact that an hour earlier he could not figure out how to open the door to his own bedroom. Retrospective interviews with the lower-level medical staff, the nurses, the orderlies, the junior doctors who saw him in the unguarded moments reveal a darker truth. They noticed the changes. They saw the blank stares that lasted too long. They saw the shuffling gait, the Parkinsonian stiffness that often accompanies vascular dementia. They witnessed the sudden outbursts of irritation and stubbornness that are characteristic of the frontal lobe losing its inhibitory control. But in the hierarchical culture of the White House, silence was the currency of survival. To speak out was treason. The medical file that mattered was not the one released to the press. It was the one being written in the terrified observations of those who watched the leader of the free world struggle to tie his shoelaces or remember the name of his own chief of staff. This scientific reality reframes the entire history of the 1980s. We often credit Reagan's simple communication style as a deliberate populist strategy, a way to cut through the noise and connect with the common man. The data suggests a more harrowing possibility. The simplicity was not a choice, it was a necessity. He spoke in simple sentences because his brain could no longer construct complex ones. He painted the world in broad strokes of good versus evil, not just because of his moral clarity, but because he had lost the cognitive ability to perceive nuance. As the disease stripped away the gray areas of his cognition, it left him with a black and white view of the world. Paradoxically, this pathological simplicity was effective in the binary contest of the Cold War. The Soviets were confused by him. They couldn't understand why he wouldn't engage in complex details. They didn't realize that he couldn't. But while simple language might win elections and confuse adversaries, it is dangerous in the cockpit of a nuclear superpower. The presidency requires the ability to synthesize contradictory information, to weigh subtle risks, and to anticipate second-order consequences. By the late 1980s, the forensic evidence suggests that Reagan was operating with a cognitive processor that was significantly degraded. He was navigating the most dangerous period of the 20th century with a map that was fading. The words were disappearing, and with them, the capacity for deep analysis. This was not just a tragedy for the man, it was a rolling gamble for the human species. As the vocabulary shrank, so did the world he lived in. He became increasingly isolated, not just by Nancy and the Secret Service, but by the limits of his own mind. He was trapping himself in a smaller and smaller linguistic prison. And this leads us to the ultimate nightmare scenario, the question that bridges the gap between medical tragedy and existential horror. If the president's brain can no longer retrieve the word for missile or deterrence or consequences, can it truly understand the reality of nuclear war? What happens when the man holding the codes can only speak in the language of a child, but wields the power of a god? The linguistic data proves the decline was real. The next chapter proves how close that decline brought us to the edge of the abyss. The bear was real, but the man standing in the woods was slowly forgetting how to load his gun. If the linguistic decay was a tragedy for the man, the events of 1987 represented a rolling gamble for global security. The consequences shifted from political embarrassment to existential threat. The grim logic of mutually assured destruction relied on a single assumption, that the mind controlling the arsenal was rational. By the late 1980s, the terrified aides inside the West Wing began to realize that this assumption was no longer valid. The finger on the button belonged to a man who on certain mornings could not recall the schedule of the day. The nightmare scenario that kept the National Security Council awake was not a Soviet first strike, but a presidential misinterpretation. If the radar warning systems triggered a false alarm, as they had done in the past, would Reagan be able to understand the difference between a simulation and reality? Or would the mental freeze that paralyzed him in Louisville paralyze the chain of command, or worse, lead to a confused order that could incinerate the Northern Hemisphere? The anxiety over the nuclear codes was not hypothetical. There were whispered incidents that never made the nightly news. On one occasion, it was reported that the president had carried the biscuit, the laminated card containing the authentication codes, in his suit pocket, only for it to be misplaced or left in a discarded jacket. The most powerful sequence of numbers in human history was treated with the casualness of a grocery list. But the true danger lay in the mind, not the pocket. The system required the president to memorize a challenge response sequence. If the military aide shouted a code, the president had to respond with the correct counter code immediately. As Reagan's memory for abstract numbers and sequences began to disintegrate, The terrifying possibility emerged that in a moment of crisis, the President of the United States would simply stare blankly at the officer, locking the mechanism of defense in a moment of silence. This fear reached a boiling point in early 1987, leading to one of the most secret and dangerous episodes in American political history, the attempted activation of the 25th Amendment. This was not a plot by Democrats or the liberal media. It was an operation launched by the president's own loyal staff. After the firing of Ronald Reagan, the chief of staff who clashed with Nancy, a new team arrived at the White House, led by former Senator Howard Baker. What they found when they walked through the doors of the West Wing shocked them. They expected a functioning executive branch. Instead, they found a ghost town. The staff was demoralized. The First Lady was running the schedule via astrology, and the President was nowhere to be found. Howard Baker, a seasoned political operator, immediately sensed that the stories of Reagan's decline were not rumors. To confirm the reality, he tasked his top aide, James Cannon, with a sensitive mission. Cannon was a respected moderate, a man of integrity. His orders were to conduct a quiet but thorough investigation into the president's mental fitness. Cannon spent days interviewing the White House staff, the secretaries, the mid-level aides, and the people who saw Reagan when the cameras were off. The report he compiled, known as the Cannon Memo, is a document of devastating historical weight. The picture painted by the staff was of a president who had effectively checked out. They described a man who was lazy, inattentive, and uninterested in the job. They reported that Reagan would come down to the Oval Office late, spend a few hours reading correspondence or looking at photos, and then return to the residence to watch television or old movies. In meetings, he would read from index cards prepared by aides, but if the conversation veered off script, he would withdraw. One staffer told Cannon that the president was out to lunch. The phrase was literal. He was physically present, but the lights were off. Cannon's conclusion was stark. Ronald Reagan was no longer capable of discharging the duties of his office. On March 2, 1987, James Cannon presented his findings to Howard Baker. The recommendation was explosive. Cannon suggested that they might need to invoke Section 4 of the 25th Amendment. This section allows the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet to declare the President unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, effectively removing him from power. It is the constitutional eject button designed for comas or strokes, but now being considered for dementia. The new Chief of Staff, Howard Baker, read the memo and realized he was holding a hand grenade. If he acted on it, he would be staging a coup against a beloved figure. If he ignored it, he was endangering the country. The new team decided to conduct a final test. They scheduled a luncheon with the president for the following day. The plan was simple but tense. Howard Baker, James Cannon, and the new counsel, A.B. Culverhouse, would sit with Reagan. They would observe him closely. They would watch his eyes, listen to his syntax, and test his engagement. If he appeared senile, if he zoned out, or if he failed to recognize them, they agreed they would move forward with the 25th Amendment process. The fate of the Reagan presidency and potentially the stability of the American government hung on a single lunch. But they forgot one crucial variable. Ronald Reagan was an actor. He had spent 50 years performing for audiences, sensing the mood of a room, and delivering exactly what was required. When the aides entered the cabinet room, Reagan didn't look like a senile old man. He looked like the president. He had been prepped, perhaps by Nancy, perhaps by his own survival instinct. He saw the new faces, the audience, and the lights turned on. He was charming, he was witty, he told stories, and he engaged with them. He performed the role of Ronald Reagan perfectly. James Cannon watched in amazement. The man described in the memo, the vacant, lazy, confused old man, was gone. In his place was the great Communicator. The aides left the lunch relieved but also bewildered. Howard Baker reportedly said, "The old fellow looks just fine to me." They decided to bury the memo. The 25th Amendment plan was abandoned. They chose to believe the performance over the investigation. This moment is the pivot point of the cover-up. It was the moment the system blinked. The aides chose the path of least resistance. It was easier to manage a declining president than to remove him. It was easier to construct a protective bubble around him, to simplify his schedule, and to limit his exposure than to tell the American people the truth. But the performance at the lunch was just that, a performance. It drained Reagan. In the weeks and months that followed, the decline continued. The mental freezes returned. The confusion deepened. The decision to keep Reagan in office meant that for the next 2 years, the United States was operating on luck. The operational control of the nuclear codes remained in the hands of a man who had passed a social test but failed the medical ones. The Cannon memo was filed away in the archives, a testament to the cowardice of the political class. They had looked into the abyss, saw the vacancy in the president's eyes, and decided to close the curtains rather than fix the problem. The danger had not passed. It had simply been institutionalized. And as the administration drifted toward its end, the secrets of the president's condition began to leak out in stranger ways, not just in lost words, but in a complete detachment from the moral and legal consequences of his actions, culminating in the surreal testimony of the Iran-Contra affair, where the president's defense was that his own memory was a black hole. By 1987, the protective bubble constructed by Nancy Reagan and the astrologers could no longer withstand the external pressure. The ghost presidency, operating on star charts and silence, collided violently with reality in the form of the Iran-Contra affair. This was the defining scandal of the decade, a convoluted geopolitical scheme where the United States secretly sold anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles to the Khomeini regime in Iran, a sworn enemy, in exchange for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. The profits from these illegal sales were then funneled to the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua, explicitly violating a ban passed by Congress. It was a breach of law so severe that it threatened to result in the first presidential impeachment since Andrew Johnson. But as investigators began to peel back the layers of the conspiracy, they found themselves staring into a void. At the center of the web was not a criminal mastermind, but a black hole of memory. The central mystery of Iran-Contra was always, what did the president know and when did he know it? The investigators, led by the formidable Tower Commission and later the independent counsel Lawrence Walsh, operated on the assumption that Ronald Reagan was a rational, engaged conspirator. They were looking for the smoking gun, the order signed by the president authorizing the illegal diversion of funds. But they were chasing a ghost. When they brought the president in for questioning, they did not encounter a man trying to hide the truth. They encountered a man who seemed genuinely unable to find it within the crumbling architecture of his own mind. The testimony given by Ronald Reagan remains one of the most unsettling documents in American legal history. Under oath, the President of the United States claimed he could not remember the key decisions of his own administration. He used the phrase, "I don't recall," or variations of it, 88 times. He contradicted himself repeatedly. In one meeting with the Tower Commission, he stated that he did approve the arms shipments. A few hours later, after an aide whispered in his ear, he stated he did not approve them. Then he simply said he had no memory of the decision at all. At the time, the press and the political opposition viewed this performance with deep cynicism. They saw it as a brilliant, if Machiavellian, legal strategy. They believed the actor was playing the role of the senile grandfather to avoid perjury. It was interpreted as the ultimate Stonewall. If you claim you don't remember, you can't be trapped in a lie. But looking back through the lens of the diagnosis that would come later, a far more tragic and terrifying explanation emerges. Reagan was likely telling the truth. The specific nature of Alzheimer's disease in its intermediate stages involves the destruction of anterograde memory, the ability to encode new information. A patient can recall with crystal clarity a movie set from 1942, but they cannot form a memory of a briefing that happened 2 weeks ago. The events simply do not stick. They pass through the brain like water through a sieve. It is highly probable that Reagan authorized the arms sales, signed the papers, and then, due to the physiological decay of his hippocampus, the event was deleted. He was not lying to the country. He was pathologically innocent. He was guilty of the act, but innocent of the memory. This created a dangerous vacuum in the West Wing. Subordinates like Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter stepped into this cognitive gap. They realized that the president was operating in a twilight zone of engagement. They could get him to sign a document in a moment of clarity or perhaps in a moment of confusion, and then run a rogue operation knowing that the commander-in-chief would likely not follow up. They became the enablers of the disease, interpreting the president's vague, wandering instructions as authorization for illegal wars. The tragedy of Iran-Contra is that it was a scandal made possible by the cover-up. If the president had been mentally fit, the operation might have been scrutinized or stopped. Instead, it grew in the shadows of his neglect. The climax of this tragedy came when the Tower Commission released its report. It was a damning indictment, but not of corruption. It indicted the president's competence. It described a management style that was detached and incurious. The report famously stated that the president did not understand the nature of his own policies. This was the moment the great Communicator was officially revealed to be an absentee landlord. But paradoxically, this revelation saved him. The American public, seeing the confused, bumbling old man on their television screens, could not bring themselves to believe he was a criminal. They felt pity, not rage. His approval ratings dropped, but the calls for impeachment faded. The defense of incompetence worked. However, the cost of this survival was the destruction of the myth. Reagan spent his final 2 years in office as a diminished figure, a lame duck in the truest sense, limping towards the finish line. The Teflon president had survived the scandal, but the man inside the suit was hollowed out. He was surrounded by lawyers telling him what he had done, and he had to trust them because he could not remember doing it himself. He became a stranger to his own actions, a leader who had shaped history but could no longer recall the shape of it. The Iran-Contra affair was the final brutal proof that the medical cover-up had failed. It protected the president's dignity but endangered the republic, exposing the peril of a prosthetic presidency where unelected aides wield the power of a leader who is no longer there. As Reagan prepared to leave the White House in January 1989, the fog was thickening. The scandals, the treaties, and the wars were all beginning to blur into a singular gray static. He was leaving the world stage, but the longest and most painful chapter of his life, the long goodbye, was just beginning. When the helicopter Marine One lifted off from the White House lawn on January 20th, 1989, carrying Ronald and Nancy Reagan back to private life in California, it marked the end of an era for the world, But for the Reagan family, it marked the beginning of a different, more solitary struggle. The presidency had been a structure, a rigorous scaffold of schedules, aides, and protocols that held Ronald Reagan upright. Without the daily performance of the office, without the adrenaline of the Cold War, and the constant prompting of his staff, the scaffolding fell away. In the quiet seclusion of their Bel Air estate, the fog that had been drifting at the edges of his mind during the second term began to roll in with devastating speed. The great communicator, stripped of his podium, was about to lose his voice entirely. For years, the official line from the Reagan camp remained one of fierce denial. The former president was simply enjoying his retirement, they said. He was playing golf, chopping wood, and riding horses. But inside the family, a painful rift was opening, a divide between those who needed the myth to remain intact and those who could no longer ignore the medical reality. This silence was finally broken, not by a doctor or a historian, but by his own son. In his memoir, My Father at 100, Ron Reagan Jr. did the unthinkable. He admitted that he had seen the ghost entering the machine long before his father left the Oval Office. Ron's testimony is vital because it lacks the political motive of a rival or the clinical detachment of a doctor. It carries the specific heavy weight of a son's grief. He wrote of visiting the White House during the second term and noticing a disturbing change in his father's eyes. It was not merely forgetfulness, it was a vacuity. He described a sensation of looking at his father and feeling that the man looking back was not quite there. The lights were on, the famous smile was engaged, but the house was empty. Ron recalled a specific moment standing in the Oval Office, watching his father gaze at the familiar surroundings with a vague sense of bewilderment, as if he were a tourist in his own life. This admission shattered the official timeline, which claimed the disease only appeared in 1994. Ron was confirming that the commander-in-chief had been fighting a losing battle with his own neurons while still holding the nuclear codes. This confession sparked a firestorm of controversy. The other son, Michael Reagan, lashed out, accusing his brother of betraying their father's legacy for book sales. This family feud perfectly mirrored the national reaction, a desperate desire to protect the image of the hero against the uncomfortable truth of human frailty. But the anecdotes from the post-presidency years support Ron's account with heartbreaking consistency. Visitors to the Bel Air home began to whisper about strange encounters. Former colleagues would drop by for a chat, only to find that Reagan would tell the same story 3 times in 20 minutes, oblivious to the repetition. The stock phrases, the rehearsed jokes and Hollywood anecdotes that had been his armor for decades, were now the only things left in the arsenal. He was firing blanks. The definitive turning point came in 1994 with the release of The Letter. It remains one of the most poignant documents in modern American history. Diagnosed formally by the Mayo Clinic, Reagan decided to break the silence himself. He sat down and hand-wrote a letter to the American people. In shaky but legible script, he announced his condition. "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life," he wrote. It was a final act of courage, a moment of lucid grace before the darkness took over completely. But forensic handwriting analysts who have studied the document note the tremors in the penmanship, the hesitation marks that betray a mind struggling to command the hand. It was the last time Ronald Reagan would ever speak to the nation. After the letter, the curtain fell. Nancy Reagan, reprising her role as the ultimate gatekeeper, closed the gates of the Bel Air estate. She restricted visitors to a tiny circle of trusted friends. She did this to preserve his dignity, to ensure that the public remembered the cowboy on the horse, not the invalid in the wheelchair. But stories leaked out, and they were devastating. There is a verified account of Reagan in his later years, grabbing a broom and sweeping the leaves out of his swimming pool for hours, driven by a compulsive, repetitive motor function, unable to stop until Nancy gently guided him inside. The man who had torn down the Berlin Wall was now trapped in the loop of a single menial task. The most crushing moment, however, occurred during a Christmas dinner in the late 90s. This anecdote, shared quietly among the inner circle, illustrates the total erasure of the self. The family was gathered around the table, children, grandchildren, close friends. The atmosphere was festive. Reagan sat at the head of the table, impeccably dressed, smiling that warm, crinkly-eyed smile that had charmed the world. He raised a glass to toast the group, but as he looked around the table, his eyes settled on his own children, and the smile faltered. He leaned over to Nancy and whispered with genuine confusion, "Who are all these people?" He did not recognize his own blood. He did not know that the man across from him was the son who had watched him debate Mondale. He did not know he was the patriarch. He was a stranger at his own feast. Nancy, ever the protector, squeezed his hand and whispered back, "They're your family, Ronnie. They love you." He smiled again, accepting the information without processing it, and went back to his meal. For the family, the tragedy was absolute. The father was gone, only the body remained. This period of the long goodbye lasted a decade. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. First, the names went. Then the ability to recognize faces. Then the ability to speak coherent sentences. Finally, the ability to walk. Through it all, Nancy remained by his side, a vigil that was both heroic and tragic. She slept with one eye open, listening to his breathing. She became the keeper of the memories he could no longer hold. She retold him the story of their life over and over again, trying to pour the history back into the vessel that was leaking. There's a profound philosophical horror in this ending. Ronald Reagan built his entire life on the power of memory, the memory of an idyllic America, the memory of values, the memory of history. To have that specific faculty stripped away, layer by layer, felt like a cruel irony scripted by a vengeful God. The man who had defined the 20th century ended his life unable to remember a single day of it. He spent his final years unaware that he had ever been president. He would look at the model of the White House in his fish tank, a gift from a staffer, and trace the columns with his finger, having no idea that he had once lived inside the real thing. The great communicator had become the great silence, leaving us with a final haunting question. If the man who changed the world cannot remember doing it, did it belong to him or did it belong to the machinery that propelled him? On June 5, 2004, the ticking clock finally stopped. In the master bedroom of the Bel Air estate, with Nancy holding his hand, Ronald Reagan took his last breath. He was 93 years old. For the 10 years prior, he had lived in a world of deepening silence, a slow fade that had erased the 20th century from the mind of the man who had helped shape it. When the news broke, the nation entered a state of mourning that was both performative and genuine. The body was flown to Washington, D.C. to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. Thousands of Americans waited in line for hours in the sweltering heat to pay their respects. They were mourning the great communicator, the conqueror of Soviet communism, the optimist who had restored American pride. But beneath the pageantry of the state funeral, the riderless horse, the 21-gun salute, the eulogies from world leaders, lay a complicated and unsettling truth that a history is only now beginning to fully metabolize. The death of Ronald Reagan marked the end of the man, but it marked the beginning of the reckoning. As the grief subsided, the questions that had been whispered in the West Wing corridors during the late 80s began to be asked out loud. Was the Reagan presidency a triumph of leadership, or was it the most successful intelligence operation in domestic political history? The evidence we have gathered, the mental freezes in Louisville, the reliance on astrology, the linguistic decay in the transcripts, and the terrifying apathy of the Iran-Contra testimony, points to a conclusion that is difficult to reconcile with the celebratory statues. It suggests that for a significant portion of his second term, the United States was led by a man who was medically unfit to command, shielded by a Praetorian guard of wife and staff who placed the preservation of power above the transparency of the Constitution. However, this verdict forces us to confront a profound paradox. If Reagan was indeed suffering from significant cognitive decline, how do we explain his successes? It was during this very period of twilight that he negotiated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Gorbachev. It was during this period that he demanded the Berlin Wall be torn down. A strange and controversial theory has emerged among political psychologists. Perhaps the disease in its early stages actually aided his presidency. As the nuance was stripped away by the erosion of his temporal lobes, Reagan was left with a simplified binary worldview. Communism was bad, freedom was good. There was no gray area, no paralysis by analysis. This pathological simplicity terrified his sophisticated advisors, but it baffled and ultimately broke the Soviet leadership, who were used to dealing with cautious, calculating opponents. In a twisted irony, the deficit of the mind may have produced a clarity of will, but luck should not be mistaken for strategy. The medical cover-up was a rolling gamble with the fate of the species, circling back one last time to the image that haunted the West Wing, the nuclear football. For 4 years, that black bag was carried a few steps behind a man who, on his bad days, was guided by star charts and could not remember the names of his own cabinet. We now know that there were moments when the chain of command was brittle, held together only by the discretion of aides who decided to interpret the president's wishes rather than follow his confused orders. The fact that the world did not end in nuclear fire is not a testament to the system's strength. It is a testament to chance. We survived the twilight presidency because the crisis never came at the wrong moment. The story of Ronald Reagan's decline is ultimately a mirror reflecting the American electorate. The public saw the glitches. They saw the confusion in the debates. They heard the rumors. And yet, in 1984, they re-elected him in a 49-state landslide. Why? Because the nation, traumatized by the failures of Vietnam, Watergate, and the malaise of the 1970s, was desperate for a father figure. We wanted the myth so badly that we were willing to ignore the medical reality. We entered into a collective pact of denial. We preferred a comforting illusion to a frightening truth. Nancy Reagan and her astrologer did not trick the American people. They simply gave the audience exactly what it wanted. A star who stayed on stage until the very end, even after he had forgotten his lines. Today, as we look at a political landscape dominated by aging leaders, the Reagan precedent looms larger than ever. The 25th Amendment remains a broken mechanism, a safety switch that no one dares to flip because the political cost is too high. The lesson of the 1980s is that the institutions of democracy are not immune to the frailty of biology. Power does not protect the brain from shrinking. It only protects the secret from being told. In the final analysis, the tragedy of Ronald Reagan is the tragedy of the human condition writ large. He was a man of immense charm and significant consequence, but he was also a biological organism subject to decay. The long goodbye was a cruel ending to a cinematic life. It stripped the protagonist of his agency, leaving him as a prop in his own drama. History will remember the victories, the falling wall, the booming economy, the sunrise in America. But the forensic record remembers the silence. It remembers the blank stares in the Oval Office. It remembers the astrologer's calendar on the Chief of Staff's desk. And it remembers the terrifying truth that for a fleeting, dangerous moment in the 20th century, the most powerful seat at the table was occupied by a ghost. The clock ticks on. The codes are passed to new hands. But the question remains, when the next twilight comes to the White House, will we have the courage to see it? Or will we simply applaud the performance until the screen goes black